Welcome to ACC Position U, the show where we examine which ACC school has the best tradition at each position. Today, it's the running backs. We have a terrific panel of experts that will help us decide which school will be designated as Running Back U. But before we meet them, let's look at the criteria that was used to determine the finalists. First, we looked at how successful the players were in college. Second, how high they were drafted in the NFL. And finally, we looked at their NFL career in total. Also, since the makeup of the ACC changed over the years, we considered all players from a school's history, whether they played in the ACC at that time or not. And while the players from the last 20 to 25 years are fresher in our minds, we didn't limit our selection to just the recent past. There can certainly be arguments made for several other schools, but based on that criteria right there, we narrowed it down to 4 schools as our finalists for Running Back U: Clemson, Florida State, Miami, and Pittsburgh. Now let's meet our esteemed panel to debate the merits of each of our finalists. Roddy Jones was a 4-year starting running back at Georgia Tech and is now an analyst on ESPN and the ACC Network. Andrea Adelson is a college football writer who covers ACC sports for ESPN.com. And Wes Bryant was an offensive lineman for Wake Forest and now is a host on the ACC Digital Network. First off, thank you guys so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We'll jump right in and we'll start with Clemson and begin with you, Roddy. When you think of Clemson's running backs and the traditions that they have instilled, who comes to mind right off the top?
Well, I think the first guy that comes to mind for me is C.J. Spiller. I mean, when I got into the league, he was the guy when I stepped on the field that you wanted to be like. This is a guy that's still got the record for career all-purpose yardage. He's a college football Hall of Famer. He's got the NCAA record for most kickoff return touchdowns. This guy could do it all. He could run the ball. He could catch the ball in the backfield. And then obviously was always dangerous on those kickoff returns. If you want to know a little bit about C.J. Spiller, go back and watch that 2009 ACC championship game. Georgia Tech on one side, a team that I played on, Clemson on the other. We won the game, Georgia Tech, but C.J. Spiller was the MVP. That's how good he was. He was everything for that team. And even though I have one career tackle against him, he got tackled by a running back once, I won't hold that against him. He was the number 9 overall pick when he came out of school, so C.J. Spiller is the guy that comes to mind for me.
I wish we had time to unpack that tackle a little bit more, but consider me impressed, Roddy. Andrea, who comes to mind for you when you think Clemson running backs?
Well, Roddy, I'll take C.J. Spiller and I'll raise you a Travis Etienne. And I really feel like when we think about Travis Etienne, we think about the full development of a player over a 4-year career at Clemson. He comes in as an 18-year-old true freshman. He's got braces on, and all he knows how to do is run the ball. Couldn't block, couldn't pass catch. By the end of his career, he became a dynamic pass catcher, a great blocker, and obviously developed into a terrific running back. And I think that development speaks to some of those career accolades that we saw him receive. 2-time ACC Player of the Year. And then his senior year, he made the All-America team as an all-purpose player. And what Dabo Swinney has been able to do with running backs since his time at Clemson, from C.J. Spiller all the way to Travis Etienne, I think shows the emphasis in the way they've been able to develop their running backs into doing more than just running the ball.
Wes, what say you?
Well, I'm going to talk about a guy that's a little underrated in Clemson lore. I'm talking about CJ's backfield teammate, James Davis. Now, a lot of times when I root for a guy, it starts with the on-field swag. And he was sweet out there, rocking the number 1. My favorite rendition of those Clemson uniforms, the double wristbands. But not only did he look good out there on the field, he played good as well. Top 5 in Clemson history in rushing yards and touchdowns, 2-time All-ACC guy. He was just a bruiser in there, but had the speed that if you slept on him, he would also take it to the house, soften up that defense for CJ just a little bit. So I was a big James Davis fan and don't feel he gets quite the respect that he deserves as far as one of the ACC's greatest running backs and one of Clemson's greatest running backs.
Well, it's an interesting point that you bring up, Wes, the fact that C.J. Spiller and James Davis played alongside each other. Roddy, how impressive is it that we're talking about both those guys when they were splitting carries, being on the same team, showcasing the same offense?
I think it's really impressive, and it goes to show you that the culture that Dabo Swinney has really had take off, that family atmosphere that Clemson professes. The beginnings of that were already there. James Davis was on campus and was a big-time recruit while C.J. Spiller was getting recruited. They still get C.J. Spiller on campus, and they figure out a way not just to have those two guys split carries, but have them both excel and succeed. Talked about all the things that CJ Spiller did outside of just running the football. James Davis was never jealous and really supported. Those guys were really good friends. So I think it is incredibly impressive that we're talking about both of those guys in that stature in Clemson history.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, that wraps up our conversation regarding Clemson. The next contender is Florida State. We'll be back to look at the Seminoles when ACC Position U continues. Welcome back to ACC Position U and our look at the running backs. The next finalist we'll discuss is Florida State. Andrea, let's start with you. What Seminole running back stands out to you as one of the all-time greats in FSU history?
I'm sure my fellow panelists will be hitting on Warrick, Dunn, and Dalvin Cook, but for me, I have to highlight Cam Akers, who I believe is the most underappreciated running back in Florida State history, and really the most underappreciated running back in the ACC over the last 4 years. When you look at what he had to endure both physically, playing through injuries, in particular a very painful sprained ankle, coaching changes, and some of the offensive lines that, let's just say, were not among the best in school history, yet he still was able to rush for 1,000 yards twice over his 3-year career. He always ran tough, he always ran hard, and even though he was running for his life half the time, he always found ways to gain extra yards, and he was absolutely the most valuable player on those Florida State teams that started to struggle over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and then he goes to the pros, and he has a breakout year with the LA Rams, so certainly a decent pick by you. Wes, I'll turn it to you. Who sticks out when you think about Florida State running backs?
Well, lots of personal history when it comes to this guy. I'm talking about Warrick Dunn. Just to tell you guys, took the middle school picture in the Warrick Dunn 28 Nike jersey. Couldn't sleep the night before I wore it for the first time. I was a huge Florida State fan when I was a kid. Warrick Dunn was my guy. Again, talking about the on-field swagger, so to speak, the cleats, the back flap. I loved him, but he also got it done on the field. 3 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons. Just a big-time player. I remember the catch and run against Florida to win them that game in the swamp. I almost jumped through the roof of my house. And then he went on to the pros where they told him he was too small and might not make it, and was a 3-time Pro Bowler and was a really good back for the Buccaneers and the Falcons. So Warrick Dunn was my guy. Very personal selection for me and one of the all-time greats in Seminole history.
I think we can all get behind that, but we can't have this conversation as it pertains to Florida State without mentioning Dalvin Cook. Roddy, what do you got on Mr. Cook?
Well, first off, I want to say that Wes may have been bigger than Warrick Dunn when he put that jersey on in high school, and which goes to show you how great Warrick Dunn was. But let's talk Dalvin Cook. I mean, this is a guy that is third on the all-time ACC rushing list, and he did it in 3 seasons. 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons. Has 2 of the top 10 seasons in rush yards per game. He got going right as the Golden State Warriors really started to roll, and I used to call him the Steph Curry of college football, because anytime you handed him the football, there was a chance that he was going to put it in the end zone no matter where he was on the field. Gets drafted in the second round. How he fell to the second round, I don't know. But gets drafted in the second round by the Minnesota Vikings. He's been a 2-time Pro Bowler already. And the dude has been incredible both in college and in the NFL. He is one of the most exciting backs I've ever seen, and he is in the running for the greatest running back to ever grace the field in the ACC. Absolutely love Dalvin Cook and what he did in the Florida State uniform.
But I think it's important to note that both Dalvin and Warrick played on national championship caliber teams. Yeah. Andrea, to your point, Cam Akers did not. So does that make Cam Akers' college career that much more impressive with all the stats and accolades he was able to garner, Andrea?
In my estimation, it does. That's why I wanted to highlight him, because I went to many Florida State games over the last 3 years and just watched him struggle behind the offensive line and yet break away and make some incredible runs and make some incredible yards. And when Florida State had the coaching transition between Jimbo Fisher and Willie Taggart, Cam never wavered. He never wanted to leave. He was committed to Florida State, and he continued to do his best despite all of the adversity that he faced in front of him. And so that's why I wanted to include him. Obviously, Warrick, Dunn, and Dalvin Cook are one of the greatest, or two of the greatest Florida State players of all time. But I do think Cam Akers has the potential to be there, especially if we see more out of his career with the LA Rams.
And let's not forget, Cam Akers was a high school quarterback who could sling it in a Florida State uniform, too. Maybe the greatest throwing running back in Florida State history. The dude's got a cannon.
Yeah, he certainly did. Great point by you, and phenomenal points all across the board. We'll close the book on the Noles for now, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the Hurricanes and the Panthers. Clinton Portis, Tony Dorsett, and more when we continue on ACC Position U. Welcome back to ACC Position U. We have two more schools to consider in our running backs U group, Miami and Pitt. Wes, let's start with you and get the ball rolling. Who set the standard for Miami running backs?
Well, you have to talk about Edgerrin James, a special player, NFL Hall of Famer. This guy was such a big-time player at the U, could catch the ball, run the ball, whatever you needed him to do, he did it, and he was a quiet assassin. No celebrations, no trash talk, just going on the field and getting it done. I remember reading about him coming up, how he worked hard in the fields in the Immokalee, where he was from, just a grinder. And just another quick story, I remember when he got drafted in front of Ricky Williams in the draft back in the day. That was such a big controversy when the Colts took him, and we were waiting for the cable to be installed, but I couldn't wait any longer. I had to listen on the radio. I remember them announcing the pick and him getting booed by the fans because they wanted Ricky, but Edge just went to the league, was Peyton Manning's right-hand man, and had a Hall of Fame career, and also was just a tremendous play in college. So I love Edgerrin James.
Speaking of Hall of Fame career, he just gave one of the most memorable speeches in Canton, Ohio. So kudos to him for that as well. Roddy, who do you think of when you think Miami backs?
Well, look, I'm sandwiched between some all-time greats, but I wanted to bring attention to a guy who, like we talked about with Cam Akers earlier, is probably a little underrated in Miami history, and that's Duke Johnson. I mean, this is a guy that's top 10 all-time in all-purpose yards in ACC history, over 3,000 career rushing yards, and he was able to do it all for Miami. Obviously, the rushing yards we talked about, but the receiving yards out of the backfield was explosive, was an incredible kick returner too. So just a dangerous player for Miami in that mid-2000 teens. Duke Johnson was as exciting as it got in the ACC at that time. I know when you've got names like Edgerrin James and Clinton Portis and Willis McGahee and guys like that, it's tough to overshadow those guys. But in recent history, Duke Johnson was about as good as it got as a third-rounder to the Cleveland Browns.
Andrea, do you agree with Roddy, or do you have someone different in mind?
I'm glad Roddy mentioned Duke because he actually played in the ACC. And I know we're not supposed to hold that against Miami, but of all the running backs we're going to talk about, Duke actually played really, really well. And I think a lot of people do forget that he's one of the all-time leading rushers in Miami history. So thank you for mentioning him, Roddy. I had the great fortune of covering the 2001 Miami Hurricanes. So, of course, I have to mention what I think is the greatest backfield of all time when you consider they had Clinton Portis, Willis McGahee, Frank Gore, and Najee Davenport all trying to carry the ball for them. And when I had this chance to cover this team, and you're sitting there and you're watching all of these future NFL players, all you can think to yourself is, how did this team amass such an incredible group of players who are so talented? And that specifically speaks to those running backs. All of them were drafted. Frank Gore is going to be a future NFL Hall of Famer. And they all were able to get their carries and their yards without getting mad at each other. This was a complete team effort from top to bottom. Frank Gore was just a freshman on that team. And so, for me, 2001 Miami and that backfield stands alone in terms of the depth and talent at that position.
Do you guys like how Andrea just bends the rules? We ask for one person, and she's like, "Oh no, I'm
the
going to give you four. I'm going to give you a whole
I thought it was going to
group."
crescendo in one guy, and then she just kept going.
Just keep that in mind in your back pocket. You can pick a group of people. Let's pivot to Pitt. How about that for some alliteration? Roddy, we'll start with you. Who comes to mind when you think of the Pittsburgh Panthers in that running back room?
Well, look, call it recency bias. I'll actually call it what Andrea said. This guy played in the league. It's James Conner. Well, first off, you got to go to his sophomore season. Over 1,700 rushing yards, ACC Player of the Year, had an absolutely incredible season. And then he has an MCL sprain the next year. They find out he has Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I know that this is on the field, but the story that he had, overcoming cancer, being able to come back to the field and have another 1,000-yard season before being drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers, that hometown team for James Conner. It's just an incredible story. And not only the story, but he was a great player. Power, ran through guys, had the speed to pull away from some slower defensive backs and certainly everyone else on the field. This was a guy who was an absolute load with an incredible, inspiring story. Had a nice little stretch there in the league as well. So I think of James Conner. Call it recency bias. I'll call it just loving a great story and a great player.
I won't call it recency bias. I respect that pick very much. Andrew, what say you?
I love James Conner as a player, and I'm probably biased because I got to cover him a lot. He started out as a defensive end, everyone, and then he goes on and becomes this incredible running back for Pitt. But I'm going to highlight Curtis Martin. And he's a player I got to know when I covered the New York Jets at an earlier stage of my career. And the thing that always stood out to me about Curtis Martin was he wasn't the flashiest player. He wasn't the fastest player. Yet somehow at the end of the game, he ends up with 100 yards. Every single time. One of the most consistent running backs in NFL history. And I think a lot of people forget that he ranks number 4 all time in the NFL in rushing yards. Obviously, he's a Hall of Famer. And what happened in his Pitt career actually spurred his NFL success. You know, when you look at his numbers at Pitt, they don't match up to what James did. And a lot of that is because he wasn't focused and committed to football. And it wasn't until his coach, Johnny Majors, told him when Curtis was considering leaving for the NFL draft, Curtis, why would you do that? You're never going to succeed there. And that drove him to have this work ethic that was second to none in the NFL and eventually led him to his Hall of Fame career. And when he came back and saw Johnny Majors at Pitt, he thanked him for giving him that motivation to be better than he ever was at Pittsburgh.
And any true competitor has to appreciate that kind of mindset and that kind of motivated, personality. So I love those anecdotes. Thanks for sharing. Wes, when you think of Pitt, who comes to mind at the forefront?
Well, this guy was a little bit ahead of my time, but I am certainly familiar with Tony D, a.k.a. Tony Dorsett. There are some guys that, a lot of guys in college have great careers, but this guy had a career that you just couldn't make it up. A 4-time All-American, won the Heisman Trophy, everything you're talking about with the speed, the moves, the agility. He was just silky smooth on the field, then went to the pros, was a first-round pick, did not disappoint. NFL Hall of Famer, was just a stalwart for the Cowboys in that backfield. And it's also something to be said for guys who come out of high school and they're legendary, and they come to college with lofty expectations, and they live up to them or surpass them. And this is certainly one of those players. Tony Dorsett is a guy that you could make the case that he's arguably the greatest or one of the 5 or whatever number you want to go to greatest running backs of all time in college football. This guy had it all, and he was a guy that, I guess the ladies loved him and the guys wanted to be like him because he was the man. So Tony D, taking my hat off to him.
It's a good way to be. That's a good way to be. So we've stated our case for the finalists in Clemson, FSU, Miami, and Pitt. Which school will our panel of experts pick as running back U in the ACC? We'll find out next when we come back. Welcome back to ACC Position U. A quick review of our criteria. We considered college careers, NFL draft positions, and NFL careers in their entirety. And now it is time for the moment of truth. Who does our panel think has the best running back legacy in ACC football between Clemson, Miami, Pitt, and Florida State? Roddy, I'll let you go first and do the honors. Who are you picking for ACC Position U as it pertains to running backs?
All right, I drew the short straw, having to go first, but this one was difficult. There were a lot of factors to consider. I went Miami as position U, and here's why. You've got it all when you talk about Miami. Number one, they've had the most picks at running back since the year 2000, 11 overall, which leads all the teams in the ACC, regardless of their conference affiliation at the time. And as Andrea said, just look at that 2001 backfield. You can put that alone out there and make a case for Miami. So I'm going with Miami as position U in the ACC.
Okay, one vote for Miami. Andrea, are you supporting Roddy's claim or refuting it?
Roddy, geez, you're using my argument against me because I was going to go with Florida State, and now I'm reconsidering everything. Why did I pick Florida State? The reason I went with Florida State is because of the longevity of the running backs being spectacular there, starting obviously with Warrick, Dunn, and then going all the way up to Cam Akers. And when I think about position U, I want to look at both collegiate success and NFL success. For me, Florida State, because they've been able to do it as long as they have with elite players both in college and the NFL, that's why I went with Florida State. But I'm with Roddy. This is a very difficult choice. I also considered Clemson because of the recent success that they have had in churning out all ACC running backs under Dabo Swinney, and they also have past success too. But I'm going to stick with Florida State, even though I made that case for 2001 Miami.
Okay, we've got Miami and Florida State. Wes, that means you're the tiebreaker, or you could just have a split decision.
Well, this might be the only time in my life that I do this, but I have to throw up the U, if you can see that. I'm going to go with Miami as well. You're talking about two running backs inside the top 13 all-time in NFL rushing yards with Frank Gore and Edgerrin James. Duke Johnson is a guy that is very underrated, doesn't get talked about, and he's up there in a lot of the important rushing records in ACC history. So the U has definitely put it out. Willis McGahee was also a huge favorite of mine and how he dominated. So the Miami Hurricanes, just an embarrassment of riches. Tons of really good NFL players that were also great stars at the collegiate level, whether they had to split carries or not. So I'm going with the U.
All right, so Miami wins ACC Position U for running backs. Are we all okay with that? I mean, Andrea, you said you were being swayed as Roddy spoke. So are you okay?
Yeah.
Well, clearly I'm in the minority here, and I grew up in South Florida, so I'm a little concerned I'm going to be getting some hate tweets over the next
we'll protect you.
Few days over this. So I'm sticking with Florida State.
Okay, I appreciate it. 2 votes for Miami. Thank you guys so much for your insight, for your stories. They were wonderful. And that's it for our running backs. Tune in next time, and we'll tackle, no pun intended, another position on ACC Position U.